A 24-year-old insurance broker lay dead in the hallway of his New Hampshire condo, executed with a single hollow-point bullet to the head. His blood soaked into the pristine white carpet. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. A few feet away, his young widow wept for the arriving police, but the tears vanished the second the television cameras turned off. She was a high school media coordinator, and she treated her husband's brutal assassination like a student film project. She didn't just want him dead, she wanted to direct it. Derry, New Hampshire, in the late 1980s, was a quintessential blue-collar town where local ambitions usually mirrored the steady, predictable pace of New England life. Gregory Smart fit seamlessly into this landscape. Born in 1965, he was an easygoing young man with a deep affinity for heavy metal music and a remarkably laid-back approach to his future. Friends knew him as a fiercely loyal companion who spent his weekends playing guitar and socializing. He was fundamentally a pragmatist. Realizing that rock and roll wouldn't pay the bills, he eventually settled into a practical career as a regional insurance broker. It was a job that promised stability, a quiet, comfortable existence that he was entirely content to accept. Pamela was wired differently. Raised in Miami before her family relocated to the Northeast, she possessed an intense, almost manic drive to be noticed. She despised the idea of a quiet suburban life. Her eyes were permanently fixed on a larger screen, idolizing national broadcast journalists and aggressively pursuing a career in television media. During her time at Florida State University, she hosted a college radio show focusing on the same heavy metal scene that Gregg loved. This shared musical interest became the initial anchor for their relationship. But while he enjoyed the music for its rebellion, she viewed her involvement in the scene as a stepping stone to a broadcast career. She meticulously crafted her image to match her lofty aspirations. Every outfit was tailored, her hair was teased to perfection, and her public interactions were heavily curated. She was ambitious, highly articulate, and fiercely protective of her persona. To her, reality was merely raw footage waiting to be edited into a compelling narrative. When the two began dating seriously, their dynamic was perplexing to outside observers. He was the relaxed rocker. She was the hyper-focused overachiever. Yet, they seemed to balance each other. Under her influence, he softened his rebellious edges, eventually cutting his signature long hair and adopting the polished, professional look she demanded. They married in May of 1989, settling down in a modest, newly built condominium unit in Derry. To their neighbors, they appeared to be a perfectly upwardly mobile young couple, rapidly checking off the boxes of the modern American dream. While Gregg comfortably settled into his insurance roots, the new Mrs. Smart pursued her media ambitions with ruthless efficiency. She accepted a position as the media coordinator at Winnicott High School, located 20 miles away in the coastal town of Hampton. The role tasked her with directing the school's regional broadcasting initiative, an ironic acronym known as Project SMAGRT, which stood for Students Making a Right Track. Her daily responsibilities involved teaching teenagers how to operate complex camera equipment, produce local public access programming, and build self-esteem through media exposure. For a woman who envisioned herself reading the evening news on a national network, managing a high school media lab felt like a severe professional downgrade. It was a windowless room filled with outdated electronics and awkward adolescents. However, she quickly discovered an unexpected advantage in this cramped studio. Among the teenagers, she was an absolute celebrity. She positioned herself not as a traditional faculty member, but as a hip, young mentor who understood their struggles better than their parents did. The high school environment provided her with a captive, easily manipulated audience. The boys, in particular, looked up to her with a mixture of reverence and adolescent infatuation, desperate for her approval and eager for her attention. In that small broadcasting room, surrounded by tripods and microphones, she finally secured the absolute power and unwavering adoration she craved. The school studio became her private kingdom, and the students were slowly being groomed into her compliant, unquestioning caste. The veneer of the perfect suburban marriage cracked before the ink on their wedding certificate was entirely dry. By the winter of 1989, The stark reality of paying a mortgage on a regional insurance broker's salary had thoroughly extinguished any romantic illusions the new bride might have harbored. Gregg was entirely content with quiet nights on their newly purchased furniture and weekends spent with a close circle of old friends. His wife was chronically restless, suffocated by the mundane routine of domestic predictability. The fatal fracture occurred when Gregg confessed to a brief, meaningless infidelity. Instead of seeking counseling or initiating a legal separation, his wife weaponized the transgression. She used the affair to seize complete moral high ground within the home, utilizing it as a constant psychological bludgeon to remind him of his failure. But beneath her displays of righteous anger, a much colder calculation was taking shape. A rational person in her position might have simply filed for divorce. She vehemently rejected that option. She complained bitterly to her close confidants that a legal separation would ruin her financially. She adamantly refused to surrender the pristine condominium she had spent months meticulously decorating. She was terrified of losing custody of her beloved Shih Tzu, Halen. Above all, she deeply feared the social embarrassment of a failed marriage. She had spent years crafting an image of flawless success. She did not want to be a 22-year-old divorcee working a low-paying public school job. She preferred the tragic, untouchable status of a grieving widow. With her marriage emotionally dead, her focus shifted entirely to the windowless broadcasting room at Winnicott High School. Among the teenagers she supervised in the media lab, one boy stood out as exceptionally vulnerable. William Flynn, known to everyone as Billy, was a 15-year-old sophomore from a deeply fractured home. He was a quiet, insecure kid, eager to please and desperately searching for a stabilizing force in his chaotic adolescence. He was the perfect clay for a master manipulator. The grooming process was methodical, heavily masked at first as academic mentorship. She started by granting the teenager special privileges during school hours, elevating him above his peers in the video production class. Soon, the attention breached all professional boundaries. She offered him long rides home in her Honda CRX, blasting heavy metal cassettes and confiding in him as if he were an adult equal rather than a sophomore. For a socially awkward 15-year-old boy, the undivided attention of a glamorous, authoritative older woman was nothing short of intoxicating. By early 1990, the psychological manipulation escalated into a calculated sexual seduction. She began inviting the teenager to her Derry condo. During the midday hours, she knew Gregg was miles away, working his insurance routes. She transformed herself into the absolute center of the boy's universe, weaving maternal care with forbidden romance. Billy fell under a state of blinding obsession. He viewed his media teacher not just as a lover, but as an infallible deity who had miraculously elevated him from a high school nobody to her chosen protector. She understood that isolating the boy entirely might eventually raise red flags, so she proactively expanded her psychological net to include his closest friends. Teenagers Pete Randall, J.R. Latime, and Vance Latham were quickly absorbed into her orbit. She effectively turned her home into a private, unsupervised clubhouse for the teenage misfits. She provided them with cigarettes, facilitated access to restricted movies, and created an environment devoid of traditional adult rules. She positioned herself as the cool older sister, the permissive den mother, and the undisputed leader of their pack. She held total authority, and the boys were completely captivated by her proximity and her rebellious aura. With her loyal, highly impressionable cast assembled, the media director began writing the script for her husband's demise. She started feeding Billy a steady diet of dark fabrications, painting Gregg as a violent monster. She told the teenager that her husband was physically abusive, that she lived in constant, suffocating terror, and that she was trapped in an inescapable nightmare. It was a masterclass in predatory psychological warfare. She knew exactly which emotional levers to pull to trigger a 15-year-old's protective, heroic instincts. When the teenager naturally suggested she pack her bags and leave the abusive home, she immediately shut the idea down. She reiterated her financial anxieties and her absolute refusal to surrender her dog or her carefully curated assets to a man she despised. She planted the seed of violence so deeply and so carefully that it eventually felt, to the boy, like his own desperate conclusion. She convinced him that the only obstacle standing between them and a lifetime of uninterrupted happiness was Gregg's pulse. The manipulation reached its critical apex when she issued a chilling, final ultimatum. She coldly informed the desperately infatuated sophomore that if he truly loved her, if he possessed the courage to save her and be with her forever, he would have to eliminate the problem permanently. If he lacked the nerve, she promised to end their relationship immediately and banish him from her life forever. Faced with the unimaginable threat of losing his goddess, the 15-year-old boy agreed to commit murder. The subsequent planning phase was surreal in its casual, suburban banality. The teenagers sat around the living room, smoking cigarettes and snacking, while their teacher laid out the operational parameters of an assassination. She instructed them on how to forcefully enter the home and stage the scene to mimic a botched burglary. She demanded they steal her husband's jewelry and ransack the drawers to make the motive look authentic to local police. Most chillingly, as she finalized the details of the hit, she gave her student assassins one absolute, non-negotiable directive regarding the execution itself. They were strictly forbidden from shooting her husband on her brand new white leather couch. She simply didn't want the upholstery ruined by the blood. The 1st of May, 1990 was chosen with clinical precision. The mastermind required a flawless, impenetrable alibi to distance herself from the violent reality of her own plan. That evening, she drove 20 miles to the coastal town of Hampton to attend a routine school board meeting, a bureaucratic gathering guaranteed to be packed with reliable, professional witnesses. Before leaving her Derry condominium, she made one critical adjustment to the property's security. She unlocked the heavy wooden bulkhead doors leading down into the basement. It was a deliberate, invisible vulnerability, engineered from the inside, leaving the fortress open for the invading force. By nightfall, the residential complex was wrapped in the quiet, predictable stillness of a suburban New Hampshire evening. A vehicle idled down the street, headlights killed, blending into the shadows. Inside sat the getaway driver, a high schooler tasked with waiting out the execution. Two figures detached themselves from the car and slipped through the manicured yards. William Flynn and Pete Randall were teenagers acting as foot soldiers in a psychosexual fantasy, operating under the absolute authority of a woman who had completely colonized their minds. They located the basement bulkhead exactly where they were promised it would be. The hinges opened silently. The boys descended into the pitch-black subterranean level, creeping up the narrow wooden stairs and slipping into the kitchen. The air inside the condo was stagnant and warm. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the refrigerator. The wait was agonizing. Time stretched, warping under the crushing pressure of adrenaline and fear. Billy gripped a heavy, stolen .38 caliber revolver. His palms were slick with sweat, slipping against the checkered grip of the weapon. He was a high school sophomore, standing in the dark, waiting to assassinate a man who had never done him any harm. Pete paced silently beside him, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a hunting knife. Every passing set of headlights reflecting against the living room walls sent violent spikes of panic through their nervous systems. They avoided the pristine white leather couch, treating the furniture like a minefield. The psychological weight of their teacher's final ultimatum pressed down on them in the suffocating dark. Approaching 10 o'clock, the atmosphere shifted. The low rumble of an engine pulling into the driveway, the distinct scrape of tires on asphalt, the heavy thud of a car door slamming shut. Footsteps echoed on the concrete walkway. Keys jingled, the deadbolt clicked, and the front door swung open. Gregg stepped into the foyer, shedding the deep exhaustion of a long day driving insurance routes. He never had a chance to reach for the light switch. Pete lunged from the peripheral shadows. The ambush was fast, clumsy, and brutally violent. He drove his weight into the older man, pinning him backward against the wall and pressing the cold steel of the hunting knife hard against his throat. The sudden, explosive violence stripped away the homeowner's ability to fight back. Gregg was violently forced down onto his knees in the narrow hallway. The darkness was absolute. The confusion was total. Pinned to the carpet, the insurance broker began to beg for his life. Through breathless, terrified gasps, he told the masked intruders that they could take absolutely anything they wanted. He offered them his wallet, his credit cards, his car keys. He frantically promised that he would not go to the authorities, swearing that he just wanted to survive the night. As the edge of the blade bit harder into his neck, Gregg desperately offered the ultimate symbol of the marriage that was currently orchestrating his death. He told the teenagers to take his wedding ring. It was a tragic, desperate irony, trying to purchase his life with the very symbol his wife so deeply despised. Billy stood over the kneeling man. The .38 caliber revolver shook violently in his grip. The cold, mechanical reality of murder suddenly collided with the romanticized fantasy he had been sold in the high school media lab. Hesitation paralyzed his finger. He froze, staring down at the terrified man on the floor. From the carpet, Pete hissed at his friend. He aggressively urged the younger boy to finish the job, demanding he pull the trigger before the homeowner realized he was dealing with panicked teenagers and decided to fight back. Billy squeezed his eyes shut. He pulled the trigger. A deafening, catastrophic crack ruptured the silence of the condominium. The hollow point bullet struck Gregg in the side of the head. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. His body collapsed forward, hitting the hallway floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. The metallic ringing of the gunshot bounced off the drywall, quickly replaced by a profound, suffocating stillness. The sharp, acrid stench of burnt gunpowder filled the narrow corridor. Thick, dark blood began to pool rapidly, soaking deep into the carpet, safely away from the white leather upholstery, exactly as the director had demanded. Panic immediately hijacked the teenagers' motor skills. The adrenaline surge pushed them into a frantic frenzy to execute the second phase of the operation. They scrambled over the body and sprinted into the master bedroom, tearing drawers from the dressers and violently scattering clothing across the floor. They snatched a handful of inexpensive jewelry, stuffing the items into their pockets to fabricate the illusion of a random burglary gone wrong. In their blind haste, they left expensive, easily pawned electronic equipment entirely untouched. A glaring amateur mistake that would later severely complicate the narrative. Within minutes, the boys bolted back down the stairs, fleeing through the basement doors and vanishing into the cool night air to find their idling getaway car. Less than an hour later, the architect of the slaughter returned to the scene. She did not return alone. She had deliberately offered a ride home to a teenage student intern, ensuring she had a naive, unimpeachable witness present for her upcoming performance. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open. She feigned immediate confusion at the darkness and the violently ransacked living room. She called out her husband's name. She took a few steps down the hallway. Upon looking down at the lifeless, blood-soaked remains of the man she had married just 1 year prior, she unleashed a theatrical masterpiece of hysteria. She let out a piercing scream, turning and sprinting back out the front door into the quiet street. She desperately pounded on her neighbors' doors, sobbing uncontrollably and demanding someone call an ambulance. When the local patrol cruisers arrived, their red and blue lights slicing through the suburban darkness, they found a young widow shattered by grief. She was hyperventilating, physically supported by her shocked neighbors. She appeared completely broken, but as the seasoned detectives secured the crime scene and began taking her initial statement, they noted something subtly discordant about the grieving woman. Her cries were incredibly loud, yet her face lacked the physical swelling of genuine anguish. Her eyes remained remarkably dry, despite the supposedly blinding shock of finding her husband executed in their hallway. She answered the investigators' questions with precise, chronological, and highly articulate detail. Her narrative flowed perfectly. It was a flawless first take, but to the trained detectives observing her in the flashing emergency lights, it felt entirely like a rehearsed performance. The investigation into Gregg Smart's death initially struggled to gain momentum, hampered by the meticulous, albeit amateurish, efforts of the perpetrators. The crime scene, a staged burglary, was a paradox of high-stakes violence and baffling incompetence. Detectives moved through the condo searching for evidence that simply did not exist. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle, and no fingerprint evidence that pointed to a professional criminal. The only physical clue was a single spent .38 caliber casing and a smear of blood that the killer had managed to leave on the carpet. It was a sterile, frustrating puzzle that left the local authorities grasping for any thread to pull. The rumors swirling through the halls of Winnicott High School were immediate and suffocating. The students, many of whom were intimate with the media coordinator's secret after-hours gatherings, recognized the patterns of the crime long before the investigators did. They whispered about the missing school equipment, the strange disappearance of the media lab keys, and the abrupt, erratic behavior of the boys who had been favored by their director. The social environment of the school underwent a jagged, painful transformation. A palpable sense of dread settled over the campus, as if the students were collectively realizing that their mentor, the woman who taught them to frame the world through a camera lens, had been teaching them something far more sinister. The investigative breakthrough finally arrived from the most unlikely source, a 15-year-old intern named Cecilia Pierce. She had been deeply entrenched in the director's inner circle, frequently spending time at the Derry condo and observing the disturbing dynamics between the media teacher and her hand-picked group of boys. Cecilia had been deeply unsettled by the atmosphere. She witnessed the overt manipulation, the subtle grooming, and the strange dark conversations that occurred when the cameras were powered down. When the police began to tighten the perimeter around the high school social group, Cecilia made a decision that would ultimately shatter the mastermind's defense. She went to the authorities and agreed to wear a body wire. The subsequent FBI wiretaps captured a reality that was far more grotesque than the police had initially imagined. The recordings presented a chilling, dispassionate account of the mastermind's psychological control. In the transcripts, she didn't sound like a victim of circumstance or an accidental bystander. She sounded like a director in post-production. She relentlessly interrogated the teenager about the specifics of the murder, checking the quality of his performance, ensuring that every detail of the staged burglary aligned with the script she had written months prior. She expressed genuine irritation, not toward the boys who had taken a man's life, but toward their failure to hide the stolen evidence properly. She was annoyed that they had left a pair of boots in a location that might lead back to the school. She demanded to know why they had panicked and left so quickly, potentially jeopardizing the entire narrative she was constructing. The wiretaps provided the police with more than just a confession. They provided a psychological blueprint of a woman who felt absolutely zero empathy for the man she had ordered to be executed. In the tapes, she discussed her husband as if he were an obstacle that had been successfully removed, a problem solved. She spoke with a level of cold, clinical detachment that terrified the seasoned detectives. Every time she urged the boy to stick to their fabricated story, she was essentially editing the footage of the murder to ensure a clean, compelling, and utterly false version of events reached the public. As the detectives synthesized the recordings, with the testimony starting to trickle in from the other boys, who were beginning to crack under the mounting psychological pressure, the defense of the terrified victim completely evaporated. The investigators stopped looking for a mysterious burglar and started looking for a director. They tracked the weapon, confirmed the origin of the stolen jewelry, and mapped out the exact movements of every person involved on that humid night in May. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just fitting together. They were forming a picture of premeditated, director-led execution that was as meticulously crafted as any school news segment. The mastermind was no longer the one pulling the strings. She was being slowly, inevitably tightened into them. When March of 1991 arrived, the Rockingham County Superior Court ceased to be a quiet venue for local justice. It morphed overnight into an unprecedented high-voltage media spectacle. Long before the era of ubiquitous, round-the-clock courtroom broadcasts, this proceeding was permitted to be filmed from gavel to gavel. Heavy broadcast trucks choked the narrow streets surrounding the brick building. Thick, black coaxial cables snaked through the public corridors, secured with heavy tape to the linoleum floors, leading directly to a battery of television cameras positioned strategically inside the gallery. It was the birth of a new cultural obsession, a localized tragedy amplified into daytime television programming. The public appetite for the story was voracious, fueled by the sordid intersection of a high school educator, teenage assassins, and suburban bloodshed. The atmosphere outside the courthouse resembled a carnival, complete with aggressive reporters shouting questions and locals lining up in the freezing New England air just to catch a glimpse of the defendant. The prosecution recognized early on that securing a conviction against a woman who had never actually touched the murder weapon required the absolute cooperation of the teenagers who pulled the trigger. Deals were struck in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of police interrogation rooms. The teenage foot soldiers agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges of second-degree murder. They accepted heavy adult prison sentences with the distant hope of parole, entirely in exchange for their unfiltered testimony against their former mentor. It was a brutal transaction. The boys were forced to publicly dismantle the toxic fantasy they had been sold in the high school media lab, trading their fierce loyalty to their goddess for a fraction of leniency from the state. When the cooperating teenagers were called to the witness stand, the oppressive atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Stripped of their youthful bravado, clad in oversized, poorly fitting dress suits, they looked remarkably small beneath the harsh glare of the studio lights. The star witness, the 15-year-old trigger man, presented a deeply pathetic figure. Under oath, he meticulously detailed the mechanics of his grooming. He explained to the jury how the older woman had systematically isolated him, intoxicated him with sexual attention, and ultimately presented the assassination as a binding test of his devotion. His testimony was jagged and emotionally raw. He wept openly, his voice fracturing as he recounted the suffocating darkness of the condominium hallway and the metallic, deafening crack of the heavy revolver. Across the room, seated at the defense table, the accused mastermind remained entirely statuesque. She did not avert her gaze or offer a single display of remorse while listening to the boy she had corrupted sob through his confession. Her posture was rigidly perfect. Her outfits were carefully coordinated, her hair teased and styled with the precise volume required for standard definition television broadcasts. To the seasoned journalists packed into the gallery, it was intensely unsettling to observe a defendant who appeared far more concerned with her lighting and camera angles than the prospect of spending the rest of her natural life in a maximum security penitentiary. The state's devastating centerpiece was not just the tears of a manipulated adolescent, but the cold, indisputable permanence of magnetic tape. Prosecutors played the audio recordings secured by the teenage intern. As the cassettes rolled, the defendant's disembodied voice filled the hushed courtroom. The jury listened in stunned silence as she casually critiqued the execution, complained about the logistical failures of the getaway, and coached the intern on how to evade police questioning. The acoustic quality was rough, plagued by analog static, but the psychological implications were crystal clear. The recording stripped away any remaining illusion of her innocence. They exposed a calculating, utterly remorseless architect attempting to manage a severe crisis of production. In a desperate, high-stakes gamble, the defense team put their client on the stand. It was the exact moment the television networks had been anticipating. She approached the witness box with the practiced, effortless confidence of a local anchorwoman stepping up to a teleprompter. Her testimony was a masterclass in deflection. She vehemently denied ever orchestrating the hit. She crafted an entirely alternative narrative, claiming that the teenage boy had developed a dangerous, unreciprocated obsession with her. She insisted that he had acted entirely on his own, executing her husband in a blind, sociopathic fit of adolescent jealousy. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, terrorized by an abusive husband, stalked by an unstable student, and unfairly persecuted by an aggressive media establishment eager for ratings. But her polished veneer rapidly disintegrated under the crushing pressure of cross-examination. The lead prosecutor methodically boxed her into tight corners, using her own recorded words to trap her in a labyrinth of contradictions. When directly confronted with the audio tapes, her explanations became increasingly strained and intellectually insulting. She attempted to redefine clear, conspiratorial instructions as innocent, out-of-context misunderstandings. The more she spoke to defend her carefully constructed image, the more her sociopathic detachment bled through the heavy foundation and applied makeup. She could perform flawlessly when she controlled the script, but under the harsh, unscripted interrogation of a seasoned trial attorney, her absolute lack of fundamental human empathy became the most damning evidence of all. The jury was no longer looking at a grieving widow or a frightened educator. They were looking at a director whose final production had spectacularly collapsed. The jury's deliberation was remarkably brief, a direct reflection of the crushing weight of the audio wiretaps. After less than 14 hours locked in an isolated room, the foreperson delivered the final act. The 23-year-old former media coordinator was found guilty of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. The presiding judge bypassed any drawn-out monologue, immediately handing down the state's mandatory sentence. It was absolute life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. There was no theatrical breakdown at the defense table. She absorbed the total eradication of her freedom with the exact same chilling, blank composure she had maintained throughout the spectacle. The teenage foot soldiers faced a drastically different reality. The triggerman and the boy who wielded the hunting knife both received sentences of 28 years to life, a heavy, concrete toll for a violently misguided infatuation. The getaway driver and the lookout absorbed lesser, though still substantial, terms in state custody. They traded the entirety of their youth to escape a lifetime behind bars, slowly aging into forgotten men. Meanwhile, the mastermind who had engineered their destruction was permanently exiled to a 6 by 9 foot cell, finally receiving the captive audience she always wanted, just not the one she had planned for. Decades later, the architect of the New Hampshire condominium murder remains locked behind reinforced steel. She spent her early 20s meticulously crafting a flawless suburban persona, desperately chasing the glaring spotlight of national television. In the end, she got exactly what she wanted. Her name became universally recognized, broadcast across millions of screens worldwide. But the heavy iron doors of a maximum security penitentiary serve as a constant, suffocating reminder. She is no longer the director of the narrative. She is simply an aging inmate, trapped forever in the final frame of her own grisly production. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.